The words landed like a slap in the middle of the wedding reception. My father stood, glass raised, and said clearly enough for 200 guests to hear, "This is my lazy, fat daughter." His voice carried, the smirk on his lips daring anyone to object. Laughter followed. Not all at once, but in ripples, those brittle chuckles people offer when cruelty comes dressed as humor, and silence feels like complicity. I stood frozen in my navy dress, pearls from my late mother resting against my collarbone, my cheeks burning hot while my heart pounded like a drum. It wasn't the first time. For as long as I could remember, my father's favorite pastime had been mocking me. As a child, he called me names in grocery aisles, church parking lots, and family gatherings, whittling down my sense of worth until invisibility became my only shield. My brothers had been the golden children, lean and loud, while I was the one he labeled useless, big, or slow. By the time I was a teenager, I understood that keeping my head down was safer than demanding respect. He ran a plumbing and HVAC shop behind our house, a man good with pipes and fittings, but careless sometimes, vicious with words. If something leaked, he tightened it. If one of us hurt, he mocked it. My mother tried to counterbalance him with casseroles and tenderness, but her love could never undo the cuts of his public ridicule. She defended me in small ways, yet she was quiet when his jabs came hardest. Humiliation loves a parking lot. I learned, where men laugh at insults and women look away, in that silence. I grew up believing my body was an apology I owed the world. By high school, I had begun searching for a way out. I was an average runner, preferring long, steady miles over sprints. And when a guidance counselor slid an army brochure across her desk, something inside me caught fire. Discipline, grit, resilience. Those words felt like a language I could speak. My father scoffed when I mentioned enlisting. "You'll quit the first time someone yells at you," he said. "You can't even handle a hill run?" He laughed. My mother folded her napkin, and I stayed silent as always. But on my lunch break one day, I signed the enlistment papers, at 19. I lifted my duffel onto a bus seat and didn't look back. Boot camp was brutal, but it also felt like mercy. Drill sergeants shouted, but their voices didn't cut the way my father's did. Their orders weren't meant to humiliate, they were meant to harden. Shine your boots, fold your blanket tight, run until your lungs scream. Every command was clear and measurable. For the first time in my life, my worth was not up for debate. My stubbornness, my neatness, my willingness to endure these qualities turned into strengths. I excelled. By the time I finished my first deployment to Iraq, I was a different woman. When Afghanistan followed, I wore new stripes and bore new responsibility. My soldiers knew me as steady, fair, relentless. They didn't need me thin or beautiful. They needed me reliable, and I was. Through the years, I rose through the ranks. One commendation, one promotion at a time, major, then lieutenant colonel, and eventually colonel, with a battalion under my command. But at home, I never spoke of it. At funerals, holidays, and family dinners, I dressed in cardigans and jeans, letting my father believe I had become nothing more than an office worker. He never asked about my life, and I stopped volunteering answers. If he couldn't be proud, I would stop offering him the chance to belittle me. It was easier to wear invisibility than to fight a battle I knew I couldn't win. Then came the wedding. My only son, Mark, had fallen in love with Jennifer Hastings, a bright young lawyer from an old Virginia family with deep roots and deeper pockets. The Hastings hosted the reception at their glittering country club, a place of chandeliers, crystal, and soft-voiced waiters carrying silver trays. From the moment I stepped inside, I could feel the appraising looks. Jennifer's parents were polite but distant. Her mother's smile stretched thin. Her father's handshake cool. The wealth in the room was the kind that notices small-town accents and plain shoes. But I reminded myself that the day was not about me. The ceremony was beautiful, brief, and honest. Mark's hands trembled as he slipped the ring on Jennifer's finger, and my heart ached with love for him. The reception followed with prime rib, champagne toasts, and laughter that filled the ballroom. My father arrived late, as he often did when he wanted to command attention. His suit was too shiny, his tie garish, his aftershave sharp enough to sting the air. I knew what was coming even before he tapped his glass with a butter knife. He had never been able to resist the lure of a microphone. He began with jokes, his usual bag of tricks mocking the fancy food, making the crowd laugh with practiced self-deprecation. He praised Mark, earning another ripple of warmth. Then, inevitably, he turned to me. His smirk widened, his voice carried, and he announced the words I had heard 1,000 times in smaller rooms, now amplified in front of hundreds. "This is my lazy fat daughter." The crowd laughed, and in that moment, I felt the old humiliation return like a fist to the chest. My hands lay still on the white tablecloth. I had cleaned rifles with these hands, signed orders that changed lives, steadied soldiers in combat zones. But here, in this ballroom, I was reduced again to the family embarrassment. My son stared at his glass, unable to meet my eyes. The Hastings family looked politely horrified, and my father continued, warmed by the cruel laughter of strangers. But then it happened. 4 young men at the head table, groomsmen in tuxedos, exchanged a glance. They had carried weight with me before, though my son never knew it. They were my soldiers, my men from Afghanistan, standing quietly until now, together. Their voices cut through the noise. "Sir, she's our commanding officer." The ballroom froze. My father sputtered, choking on his wine, while silence fell thick and heavy. And for the first time in decades, the weight shifted. It was no longer mine to carry. The silence in that ballroom was unlike anything I had ever known. It was not the uneasy hush of small-town gossip or the momentary quiet that follows a cruel remark. This was heavier, thicker, a silence that demanded attention. Forks paused mid-air. The band faltered. Even the waiters froze. My father stared at the groomsmen, his face red, wine dripping down his chin where he had sputtered. And for once, he was without words. The groomsmen did not flinch. They stood steady, not in parade formation, but with the calm authority of men who had shared foxholes and convoy routes. One of them, Miller, his voice even, added, with respect, "Sir, she led us in Afghanistan. We'd prefer you speak of her accordingly." The words were not loud, yet they carried like thunder across the room. Suddenly, the laughter that had humiliated me moments earlier became shame in the throats of those who had joined it. My father's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came. He looked around, searching for support in the eyes of the guests, but found none. Jennifer's mother clutched her necklace, stunned. Her father shifted uncomfortably, his polished superiority unraveling. Even Jennifer herself turned to look at me with something like awe, as if seeing her new mother-in-law for the first time. My son Mark stared at me, eyes wide, the recognition dawning slowly that his mother was more than the woman who packed lunches and kept the house steady during hard years. I stood still, my hands folded in my lap, refusing to smile or gloat. Years in uniform had taught me the power of composure. You don't need to shout when truth already stands beside you. And in that silence, the truth spoke louder than any defense I could have given. My father muttered something about it being a joke. about people not being able to take a little humor anymore. But his voice cracked under the weight of the groomsman's quiet authority. It was the first time I had ever seen him diminished by his own cruelty, exposed before an audience that no longer laughed. The planner, bless her heart, tried to redirect. She clapped briskly and said it was time to welcome the bride and groom. The guests obliged, raising glasses. But their claps were hesitant. Everyone was still processing what they had learned, recalibrating the picture they had carried of me all these years. For decades, I had been invisible to them. And suddenly, invisibility was no longer possible. Later, the microphone came to me. I had not planned to speak, but the planner offered me the chance to give a toast. I could have taken revenge. I could have named every humiliation I had endured under my father's voice and thrown them back at him. But I thought of my soldiers, the men who had just stood for me, and I remembered what leadership meant. When others hand you back your dignity, you don't squander it on vengeance. I stepped to the microphone and adjusted it lightly. "Thank you," I began, looking first at the groomsmen. "Thank you for your respect." Then I turned to the room. "I'm not here to correct anyone's story. I'm here to celebrate two people who chose each other. Marriage is the art of honor in close quarters. You don't have to be perfect to be honorable. You just have to tell the truth, even when it would be easier not to." I raised my glass to Mark and Jennifer. Here's to two good people getting each other home. The room rose with me, this time not out of obligation but out of recognition. Glasses clinked. Applause broke through. And for the first time that night, it felt genuine. My father stayed seated, his jaw tight, his napkin balled in his fist. But he said nothing. And that silence was a victory greater than any apology he could have offered. The night carried on, though differently than before. The band played. People danced. But a shift had occurred. Whispers ran through the crowd. "Colonel, Afghanistan, commanding officer." Guests who had laughed earlier now approached me cautiously, their words careful, their eyes searching. Some thanked me for my service. Some simply shook my hand. A young cousin of the bride asked in awe if it was true, if I had really led men overseas. I nodded, choosing kindness over spectacle, answering simply, yes. And so did many better than me. Later, as the evening thinned and cake was served, my father slipped out early. He didn't look at me. He muttered about traffic, left his stained napkin crumpled on the table, and disappeared. His absence was louder than his insults had ever been. For the first time, I realized I didn't need his approval. The truth had already spoken for me, and the people who mattered most had heard it. The following morning, I stood in my kitchen with coffee in hand, the house filled with the faint scent of flowers from the wedding. My phone buzzed with messages friends from town who had been at the reception sending mixed notes of pride and apology. "Proud of you. Sorry about your dad." Did that really happen? I set the phone down without replying. I didn't need to explain. The truth didn't require footnotes. When Mark called, his voice was tired but soft. "We're heading to the lake for a couple of days," he said. "You okay?" "I am," I told him. And for once, I meant it without reservation. He hesitated, then added, "Mom, last night, thank you for what you said. For not, lighting anyone on fire." I laughed quietly. I wasn't the one who saved the room. A few good men did. He was silent for a moment, then said softly, "They said you saved them first." The days after the wedding unfolded like ripples from a stone dropped in water. In a small town, stories move fast, carried in whispers at diners, on church steps, and in checkout lines at the grocery store. By Monday, everyone knew that Colonel Carter, though most still called me Emily, had been the subject of my father's public cruelty, and that his cruelty had finally met its reckoning. At the diner, The waitress slid an extra slice of bacon onto my plate without comment, her eyes kind in a way that told me she had heard. At the hardware store, an older man who rarely acknowledged anyone paused in the aisle, cleared his throat, and nodded at me. "Ma'am," he said simply, the word carrying more weight than any medal. I nodded back, recognizing it for what it was, respect. Long overdue. But my father didn't call. Not that day, not the next. Not even when neighbors were surely asking him what had happened. Silence had always been his tool. But now it felt different. It wasn't silence as a weapon. It was silence as retreat. And still, I knew we hadn't reached the end of this story. On the third day, I put on my walking shoes and went to his shop. The roll-up door was half open, the smell of oil and metal familiar. Inside, the radio played old country songs low, as if embarrassed by their sentimentality. He sat at his workbench with a ledger open, pencil in hand, brow furrowed like he could force the numbers to obey him. "You're open," I said, stepping just inside. "Always," he replied without looking up. I placed a socket set on the bench. "You loaned me these. I marked the ones that were yours." He grunted our family's closest thing to thank you. "I thought we should talk," I said. His pencil stilled. "We talked enough on Saturday." "No," I said evenly. "You talked. Then other people did. I'd like to speak now." He set his pencil down carefully, as if laying a fuse. "If this is about your big moment." "It's about the little ones," I interrupted. "The parking lots. The dinners. The names you used for me when you thought it was just a joke." He flinched not because he didn't remember, but because he did. "It was a joke," he muttered finally. "Jokes are supposed to be funny to the person who hears them," I said, "not just the person who tells them." His jaw tightened. People laughed. "And then they didn't," I countered. "That's the part I want you to keep." Silence stretched between us. The box fan rattled with every fifth rotation. He shifted in his seat, eyes on the radio as though a song might rescue him. "You never said what you did," he said at last. "You never told me." "You never asked," I replied. "You filled in the blanks with the story you preferred." He sniffed. "Military's just a job." "So is fatherhood," I said quietly. That hit its mark. He rubbed his jaw like he'd been struck. "I gave you what I had." "You gave me the part of you that mocks what you can't control," I said. "What you withheld was the part that names what is good and leaves it alone." He drummed his fingers on the ledger. "So, what do you want?" "An apology." "I want you to stop," I said. "Not just the big performances, the small cuts too. Stop buying power with my dignity." For a long moment, he stared at me, and in his eyes I saw both the man who had mocked me for decades and the man who, when I was 5, had let me hand him wrenches and named each one carefully: Phillips, Flathead. Crescent-like words could build a world. He looked older than he had at the wedding, stripped of chandeliers and audience. "What if I can't?" he asked. His voice wasn't defiant, it was tired. "Then we'll see each other less," I said. "I won't bring myself where I'm not respected, and I won't bring my son." He nodded once, sharp, like measuring a line. "You got hard." "I got clear," I answered. He stared at the ledger again. Then, softer than I expected, he said, "And if I say I'm sorry, then you're sorry," I said. "And we can begin again." But beginning isn't the same as erasing. He didn't answer right away. He closed the ledger, set the pencil aside, and stood slowly, like a man unused to ground that had shifted beneath him. "There's a ceremony at the Veterans Memorial on Saturday," he said gruffly. "They're dedicating a new plaque. I could stand there with you." For a moment, I wanted to reject the offer. Pride flared. Old wounds whispered. But then I heard my mother's voice inside me, soft and steady. If he reaches, let him touch the air at least. I nodded once. Okay. That Saturday was bright and blue. Ohio, in its summer kindness, the memorial was a granite wall etched with names, standing firm between the library and post office. A small crowd gathered Boy Scouts in sashes, an old teacher with a flag pin, a woman in scrubs holding a toddler. The mayor said words that were adequate but not embarrassing. An elderly Marine saluted, his hand trembling, his jaw firm. My father stood next to me, clean-shaven, his tie quiet for once. He didn't grip my arm, didn't steer me like property. He just stood. And for him. That was a sentence learned slowly. Men came forward afterward to shake my hand, and he let them. He didn't interrupt, didn't translate me into something smaller. He simply watched. On the walk back to his truck, he said quietly, "I've been mean my whole life." "You've been afraid," I said. Mean is how afraid dresses for work. He gave a short grunt. "You going to fix me now?" "I can't," I told him. "I can only draw a map. You walk across the line yourself." We stopped by the tailgate. He looked at my hands. Those rings. "I don't know what any of them mean." "Each one is a story," I said. "Not one is a joke." He nodded, a small bow to a truth he couldn't deny. For once, that was enough. A week after the memorial, my father showed up at my house at dusk with a paper grocery sack full of tomatoes. He set them gently on the counter, a paper towel beneath them so they wouldn't spot the surface. "You got any salt?" he asked, as if it were the most ordinary question in the world. It was his way of offering something without apology, a gesture disguised as produce. I handed him the shaker, and we ate the tomatoes standing up, the juice dripping onto our hands. He talked about the price of copper and how a new kid at the shop had over-tightened a valve. I told him about the sparrow in my yard bullying a blue jay at the feeder. He grunted at the story, not realizing he was nodding at a metaphor neither of us needed to stretch. He didn't say he was proud. That word might never live comfortably in his mouth. But when he left, he closed the screen door slowly so it wouldn't slam. Consideration is a dialect. I chose to take it as progress. In church that Sunday, we sat in the same pew under the wheat and water-stained glass. After the service, in the parking lot that had once been a stage for my humiliations, a man from my father's bowling league approached. "Heard your girl gave a speech at that fancy shindig," he said. My father lifted his chin. "She didn't give a speech." He replied, "She gave a standard." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. For him. Those words were as close as an embrace. Life went on, but something in its current had shifted. At a cookout weeks later in my brother's backyard, with men clustered around the grill retelling the same 3 stories they always did, my father stood beside me, holding a plate of chicken wings. When conversation turned toward the wedding, he gestured toward me and said, "This is my daughter." Everyone looked at him, waiting for the punchline, but this time, there wasn't one. He set down the plate, cleared his throat, and said, "She runs things bigger than this grill. She takes care of people, that's all I'll say." It wasn't poetry, but it was enough. For the first time in my life, my father introduced me without a joke attached. Later that evening, he stopped by my porch with a jar of pickles from a neighbor's garden. "Figured you might like these," he muttered. It was the closest thing he had to an apology, and I accepted it as such. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't come with trumpets. Sometimes it comes in jars of pickles and quiet evenings spent in rocking chairs, letting silence be gentler than it once was. I tell this story not to humiliate my father, but to honor what can grow even in rocky soil. He had been raised in a world where men measured worth by waistlines and wallets, and he passed that measure to me because it was the only one he knew. But that didn't excuse the damage. Words are hammers. They can build or they can shatter. For decades, his words had broken me down, but on one night, in a ballroom full of witnesses, truth finally stood up on my behalf. From that moment, something in our family climate shifted. Respect arrived late, but it arrived. At the diner, people stopped whispering about my body and instead asked about my soldiers. At church, no one called me Big M anymore. They called me by my name, even Jennifer, my new daughter-in-law, wrote me a card with her careful lawyer's handwriting. Thank you for not making me the villain, even when it would have been easy. I'm learning. Inside the card was a candid photo from the wedding. Me raising a glass mid-toast. The chandelier light falling not like a spotlight, but like a window opening. And my father, he never became warm or eloquent. But he began showing up with tomatoes, jars of pickles, and occasionally a quiet word that carried more weight than years of his mockery. He no longer introduced me with a smirk. He didn't call me big girl or fat. Instead, he began calling me Emily. It was the smallest change, and yet it felt like the largest. The truth is, reconciliation is not a single moment. It's a string of small mercies, repeated often enough to change the weather between two people. My father was never going to rewrite the past, but he was trying to soften the present. That was enough for me. Because in the end, I had stopped needing his recognition. I had learned to carry my own. The night of the wedding proved something I had always known deep down: you are not defined by the laughter of the room. You are defined by the truth that eventually stands beside you. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this: respect your children, even when they don't look like the picture you imagined. Especially then, the quiet child you dismiss might be carrying weight you'll never understand, leading others in ways you'll never see. And if you've ever been mocked, know this: you are not the punchline, you are the story. And one day, the truth will stand up for you too. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to know how far respect can travel.